Good Tavach. Welcome for the shiur tonight. Motzei Shabbos, Parshas Terumo. For those who didn't get the notice in advance, I apologize for the change of time. Hopefully be able to keep this 8:30 time for a couple of weeks. Let's go straight into, well, first of all, I want to express our Tefilin for Shlema, for Sarah Be'ida Bas Tikva, and for Shnei Zaman HaKohen ben Elisheva, for Shlema. So the following question number one, was put to me by someone who lives in New York, and he gives a shiur in Hayom Yom. And in anticipation of this Hayom Yom of Rov of Anash, where it talks about the brochos of the Haftorah. And it says, Bebirchas Haftorah, you see on the top right-hand corner, Bebirchas Haftorah, Oimrim Tomid, we always say, Ne'emon ורחמן oto, and we say to shiur usasamach. So a little bit of background to those two observations. So what you have on the screen now, we have here on the right side is the first print of the Alter Rebbe Sidur, which we have, which is from the Tovkov Samach Gimel. That's just about 220 years ago. And the second on the left side of the screen is from Tovkov Ein Vov, which was 3 years after the Alter Rebbe passed away. It's the first Sidur with the Chassidus, which was published by the Mitzvah Rebbe. So let's compare. In the first edition, we have Ki Kel Melech Ne'emon ורחמן oto. Baruch Ato HaShem, HaKel HaNe'emon B'chol Devorov. You are trusted and compassionate. And then HaKel HaNe'emon B'chol Devorov. So that's has the word Ne'emon ורחמן, which my research, I recall that in Sephardi Nusach, it's just Ne'emon oto, and in Ashkenazi, they have also Ne'emon ורחמן. And here in the second print, you see here, Ki Kel Melech Ne'emon ורחמן has been encircled in brackets. And then before that, there's the Nun Yud, which stands for Nusach Yoshon. This is the old version. So there seems to be, it's encircled in brackets, to seem to be saying that that's the old text, but it shouldn't be said. Now, we've got here these inverted commas, inverted segel. And that's like we would use an asterisk. Kein tzorech leima. That's how it should be said. What does that mean? That's how it should be said. Kel melech ne'emon ato, without the word ורחמן. Why should the word ורחמן be left out? Mitam shetzorich sheyomar me'ein chasima somach lechasima. The style of brochos is that when you've got an ending of a bracha called the chasima, the seal of the bracha, the penultimate part of the bracha, that which is just before the chasima, should be saying similar to the actual ending. And so because it's Ki Kel Melech, because the ending is HaKel HaNe'emon, the trustworthy, faithful, whatever the word is, however you translate it, therefore Kel Melech Ne'emon is a reflection of the ending Baruch Ato HaShem HaKel HaNe'emon. So therefore, it's the Ne'emon and Ne'emon, that they are appropriate there. The aspect of rachamim, of compassion, seems to be out of place. That's what this comment is said here. Now, is comment from the Alter Rebbe? Possibly. I don't know. We know that the Alter Rebbe published the Sidur in Tovkov Samach Gimel. That was 10 years before his passing. He wasn't totally satisfied. Lots of things were inaccurate, and he made further corrections. As I said, this is the second edition which we have on the screen. It's 3 years after he passed away, but it's very, very possible that that's his own emendation. whichever way, there is this comment in this Sidur, which is published by the Mittel Rebbe, and it says that the word ורחמן doesn't belong there. V'chein hu berambam b'seder hatfila. If you read in the end of Sefer Ahava of Rambam, there's a whole like a Sidur there, and there it doesn't have the word ורחמן. As I said before, when the Sephardi Nusach, it doesn't have the word ורחמן over here. Also in the Avud Arham, which doesn't help us because that's also Sephardi. Fine, but the Alter Rebbe here, or whoever this note is referring us to, the Rambam and Avud Arham, who don't have the word ורחמן. Okay, so clearly this note over here is to say that the word ורחמן shouldn't be said. The second part of this note includes, let's compare v'laluvas nefesh to the next brocha, v'laluvas nefesh toshia b'mheirav yomenu, and I didn't put it on the page, but in the later editions, and that's indeed the print, well, in our print, it's toshia usasamach. They've got the added word usasamach, which is pretty much unique to the Alter Rebbe's Nusach. And that's what the second part of the comment is. This introduction of the word usasamach is mitam hanal. It's for the very same reason. Because the end of the brocha is misameach tzion bevoneo, causing tzion with its children to rejoice with its children. Therefore, the shia alone is not sufficient. You shall save, speedily nowadays, to shiur sasamach. You should save and bring joy. So the word sasamach is added so that the penultimate, the rosomach lechasima, should reflect the chasima of misameach tzim bevoneha. So again, this is the second part of the comment, that to shiur sasamach, that additional word, sasamach, is for that reason of samach lechasima meina chasim. What about in the Rambam? Rambam, kosov nusach ache bezois habracha. This brocha of Rachem al Tzion, if you look in the Rambam, which he referred to as Seder HaTfilah, there the Rambam has said, Baruch atah HaShem boinei Yerushalayim. His ending is totally different. But if you are ending, this is the Rebbe, Alter Rebbe's, or the Magia is saying, if you're ending with Misameach Tziyim Bevoneha, so then you should have the element of Simcha mentioned in the part just before. So here it becomes very interesting. So for the reason of Somach Chasima Me'ena Chasima, the word Mesameach is added, and the word ורחמן is omitted. Then becomes very, very interesting. Then you look at Hayom Yom. The brochos Haftorah, we always say Ne'emon ורחמן. So despite the impression that the word ורחמן should be left out, but our minhag is to say Ne'emon ורחמן. Despite that. Yet, Tashia Sasamach, that's been included because of Samach L'Chasima Ben Chasima. So, as I said, this fellow who's a Maggid Shiur in New York and says a Shiur on Hayom Yom is asking, what's the logic here? If you're saying Tashia Sasamach, so why are you saying Ne'emon ורחמן? You should take out the word ורחמן as is Pashto Pshat over here in this note over here. So, all right, let's go back to Nusach Ashkenaz. Why does Ashkenaz throw in the word ורחמן, which doesn't seem to be appropriate here? Just one suggestion is that the word ne'emon, which means faithful, does not always have with it a positive connotation, which we said this morning in Nishmas. We mentioned it's from a posuk in Devarim, chaloyim ro'im v'ne'emonim, illnesses which are evil and faithful. And Rashi says they've been sent on a mission. So there may be a faithfulness where there's something which is undesirable being sent on a mission. And that kind of faithfulness, we're moichel. We're not asking for that faithfulness. A faithfulness with a rachman, which comes with compassion, yes. But a faithfulness, because there has been a decree, a not good decree, that there should be a faithfulness, that faithfulness we're not asking for. And possibly that's why the Nusach Ashkenaz has thrown in, has added the word ורחמן, that Hashem we want to see Hashem as a faithful king, but also with compassion. And that's why that word was put in there. And possibly once it's become the Nusach, it's also, just think technically, you can't say Ein Oimrim Rachman. It's out of order to say no Rachman. It doesn't belong. Yeah. I saw when the Rebbe would edit sichos, etc. Sometimes you edit, you cross out the word which doesn't belong there. But sometimes there were words which the Rebbe didn't want to cross out. It's like so he would circle the word and then make a line to the outside and kind of to omit it. But there are words which you can't delete. You can say it's inappropriate perhaps, but you can't delete it because the word is a good word. So the word rachman. So at any rate, that's on another aspect, another approach. But the word rachman remains there, and the Rebbe should show us just rachamim. Okay, let's move on to the next question. So there's something called tracker, which is a kind of electronic device which people now, because of the airlines losing luggage, it's become a recent epidemic. So it's popular that people have a tracker which they put in their luggage, and in this way, if their luggage goes missing, so it's got similar to a telephone, like a cell phone, which works with satellite. I don't know exactly, but it's trackable. So this fellow bought himself a new coat, cost him $250 or more, and you hang it up in shul, and there's another few hundred people there. And it's not necessarily that you're going to find your coat. So you may sometimes someone else walks off with your coat. So you put in a tracker. So he wants to know, he's asking, if I sew in a tracker into my coat, would I be allowed to wear that coat on Shabbos? So that's the question. Is a sewn-in tracker considered carrying or not? So let's read. This is from Simon. Let's read this halacha in Simon Shiur Aleph, where he talks about earlier. He talks about bells, which are sewn in, like it was common in olden times to have bells attached to clothing, festive clothing. I remember as a child going to the carnival in Westcliff and seeing these people entertaining, going around with jingle bells all over their uniforms. At any rate, so then he says, "V'chol zeh b'tachshit shehu dover hamutor latzeis boi, ve'ein tzorich sheyeh mechuber lichsus elo mishum zera shema yifsiga. Aval im chibe lichsusoi dover she'enoi osu latachshit." If you attach to your garment something which isn't a tachshit, rather you want to use it for something, and for in itself there's no permission to carry that with you. So then the fact that you sewed it to your garment would not be a permission to allow you to wear it. See, if let's say you had a ticket to enter somewhere, identity tag, which to allow you to enter somewhere, if you'd sew it to your garment, that fact that you sewed it to your garment wouldn't permit you to wear that garment with that ticket to go whichever venue that is. And it's considered as if it's detached from the garment, and you're carrying it. Because this is really an article which you want to use separately. It's not serving that garment. So it's not subservient, it doesn't become part of that garment. It could be that the garment is worth, as I said, a few $100s, and this ticket may be worth minimal amount, but it's not serving the garment. So therefore, that's not okay. Now let's come back to the case at hand, to the tracker. actually, I've been wearing a tracker on my coat for the last 20 years or more. It's a label which says Raskin 8802-1606. So that's also a tracker. It's just, it doesn't have a battery inside, but it doesn't keep me warm. It doesn't give me cover. It's there just as a tracker. And no one's ever thought about, does anyone ask about the sharpness label or the cleaning instructions on a cardigan? Is it called carrying? We don't give it any, it has no chashivas. It is subservient to the garment. It's there. And I want to just, in French and in Yiddish, you have an interesting, let's say in Yiddish you say, ich trage un Mantel und ich trage a valise. In French, je porte un manteau, je porte une valise. So the same word is used for carrying and for wearing. And so that can be confusing. What's the line between carrying and wearing? And this is what we see here. If it is being transported to use it elsewhere, then primarily that's called transportation. If its fulfillment is now as you are wearing it, so then it is not transportation, it is wearing it. So yeah, well, it's not transportation. Therefore, the ticket of washing instructions is not being transported that you need it somewhere else. It is there, it's been kind of, it's an accessory of the garment, and it's toffel to the garment. And I'm taking this a little bit further and saying the same with the tracker. It's not there to take it anywhere else. It's there to be able to track your coat in case it gets lost. If it were different, if you're going to say it's to track the person, that might be a different story. But if it's there to track the coat, then it's toffel to the coat, it's sewn to the coat. Obviously, then it's there to track the coat. I think it is okay. Interesting. On Friday, someone sent me a email asking about wearing reflective straps on Shabbos. Let's say you are in a place where the street lighting is not so good, and therefore you want to wear reflective straps. Is that called wearing or carrying? So according to the logic which I've just shared with you, I believe that's also acceptable, because the straps there, you're not wearing the straps because you need them somewhere else. You're wearing the straps to protect you as you're walking in the dark. By contrast, things like spare buttons, which someone's putting on the chat. A spare button is basically well, you buy a coat and it's got a certain style of buttons. If one of them gets lost, it's going to be possibly difficult to find a matching button. So the manufacturers kindly give you spare buttons, and the best way to store them for the eventuality that you lose a button is that they're sewn to your coat, but really they're being stored on your coat. So the way I was brought up is that you remove spare buttons before Shabbos. As a bocher, I think I once realized on Friday night in 770 that I had a spare button on my shirt, and I asked Rabbi Marlow, Aliya Shalom, and he said, take off your shirt before you leave 770, put it somewhere. And then I walked home without a shirt, but wore a jacket, so it wasn't. Then just last night, I said this brought over in davening, after davening. So someone told me that he remembers once outside 770, Rabbi Marlow saw his jacket, his coat was open, and he saw he has a few spare buttons there, and he told him you can't walk in the street with those buttons. So Rabbi Marlow was very, very machmir. Personally, and now looking in contemporary poskim, there are poskim, the Litvische poskim, would say that a button has got no chashivas. I would arbitrate and say that a shirt button doesn't have much chashivas because there's not very often that you need to use that spare button, and they tend to be, at least the shirts which I wear, the buttons seem to be fairly similar, so they're not so precious to me. By contrast, if you have a more specialized type of button, so then that is more choshev to you. If you are the type of person who likes to have matching buttons. And therefore, I would say make a point of removing them before Shabbos. Someone's pointing out that wearing the reflective straps would be possibly also an issue of sakonas nefoshes. Of course, depending on where you are, that would override any consideration. Right, but it's always nicer to know that it's permitted rather than just having to be doiche, etc. Right, let's move on. So here was a situation which is just as well that I don't answer the phone on Shabbos, because I would have been stuck with this one. So someone had I've forgotten who it was even, but it was on last Shabbos, and the Gabba called up for Revi. He called up someone who is a Levi. So now, as it's well known that Agat Shover, although he was quite lenient with the Tamimim to give them smicha, but he insisted that they should know the din of Kriyas HaTorah, because everything else you could take time and look it up. But by a problem middle of Kriyas HaTorah, everyone's standing and waiting. So here we have a question about Kriyas HaTorah. Yeah. So it's Mr. Levi is called up for Revi, and what do you do now? So this is from the Mishnah Brura, Sim Kuf Lamed Hey, Kriyas HaTorah Sif Lamed Hey, Sif Kotan Lamed Hey. He says if the Kohen or Levi were called up later on in the sequence of the Aliyahs, if they are able to, it's possible to give them maftir or acharon, so then you should ask them to stand by the side of the bima, and they will, or on the bima, whatever, you have them wait there, and then they will be given the acharon or maftir. If that's not possible, then kevan she'ola lo yered, once it's up there, you tell him to stay, and he will take Revi. And this is what the Mishnah was saying, because actually the Shulchan Aruch, as in Rabbi Yosef Karo had said, once you've done Kohen Levi Yisrael, you can then call the Kohen later. The Ramah writes that Ashkenaz don't do that. But then the Ramah himself has said, when you're stuck, then you can rely on the first svara, that a Kohen could be given an Aliya later on in the sequence of Aliyahs. So again, this fellow, that Mr. Levi is called up for Revi, if it's possible, if he's able to do a maftir, if your shul does achron. So those are the options. Those options are available. If your shul doesn't do achron, as in Chabad we don't do achron. If the person is not capable of doing maftir, or if maftir, let's say, is already booked for someone, for some other important thing, so then you'd allow them to continue. Now, let's say in the first instance that you are calling up someone else for Revi because Mr. Levi is able to do maftir. So then the next question is, do you call up the replacement by name, or do you just ask someone to go up without being called up by name? Do you do another Yamoid for the new Mr. Revi or not? So now this comes to also that same Simon Kuf Lamed Hey. Some say that so this is the Shulchan Aruch. Some say that if you called up, if the Chazan, that's the Gaba in this sense, if the Chazan called up the Kohen or Levi and is not there, so Lo Yikra La'acher B'Shem, the next fellow who's taking the position of the Kohen or Levi who's absent should not be called up by name. Mishum Pagome Shel Rishon. It shouldn't be casting aspersions on the pedigree of the Kohen or Levi who's absent. People will hear they called up Mr. Cohen, Ben Aaron Cohen, and then they called someone else. That means he's not a real Kohen. So because of that concern not to ruin his pedigree, therefore we tell the one who steps in for the Kohen or Levi is not called up by name. Now, then we have here, this is from one of the commentaries on the Sefer Shari Ephraim. He's quoting from the Shvus Yaakov. The chayra, this worry of not calling up the substitute by name is only with the Kohen or Levi, who if you call, there's a concern that people will say, oh, they're not a real Kohen, not a real Levi. But with the Yisrael, what would they say? They're not Yisrael. I mean, what's the hesitation? And therefore, but then he finishes off. Nevertheless, in many places, he says that this is a standard. That if, for whatever reason, the one who is meant to be given the Aliya isn't able to have the Aliya, so the one who replaces them, it goes up without being called up by name. Okay, so whichever way you do is fine, but that seems to be a common practice. If necessary, someone else will step in without being called up by name. Let's move on to the next. Here's a very interesting question. Shliach somewhere in Europe, I've forgotten where. And all right, you want to put on tefillin with people, wonderful. And not everyone's got the same size head. So let's say you take your tefillin and the girth of your tefillin strap is larger than the size for this young man who's ready to put on your tefillin. And so the question is here, are you able, if you can look at the picture, are you able to pull on the bottom part of the right strap in the way to shorten the girth of the tefillin strap? And this way it will fit them. But meanwhile, it's going to be hanging, it's going to be left loose, if you understand that. But you've pulled it, and now you've got a loose loop over there. As you may know, the way to adjust tefillin would be to also open that same strap from the back and to pull, and it takes a few minutes to adjust tefillin to size, and then after he's used it, then you're going to have to adjust it back to your size, etc. So it is a bit of a deal, and therefore the question is, could you just simply pull the upper strap away from the knot in a way that it's going to shorten the girth, and then put on the tefillin that way? So this is the practical question, and let's look at the question in seichel. The question here is, does the tefillin have to be secured on the head by means of a knot? We have a concept of a posuk or kashartom. The tefillin shel yad should be tied. On the tefillin shel rosh, it just says v'hoyu, l'toitafos, etc. Is it imperative that the tefillin should be secured by a knot? Now let's step aside to the tefillin shel yad. You know that there's a way the Ashkenaz kesher has got a loop on the inside of the shel yad, and then you pull it like you do a U-turn, and then you start wrapping towards yourself. That's Ashkenaz. What would happen if I had Ashkenaz tefillin, and instead of doing a U-turn, I started rolling the straps as we do, as a Sfard do? But how does the tefillin remain firm? Well, if I do it 2-3 times, it's going to remain firm on my arm. So is it imperative that the tefillin has to be secured on the arm by means of a knot? Or if it's secured, so this is pretty evident that it says in the Torah kashartom, and therefore the securing of the tefillin to the arm has to be by means of a knot. So we have a Chabad style, we have the Ashkenaz, the Sfard, but all of them, it's the knot which is facilitating that securing of the bias onto the arm. What I have on the screen is actually from Sefer Nesivim B'Snei Shlichus Chelik Gimel, and I've dealt with this very question, which just someone asked me this week. That's why it's on the list of questions. And this is from 2 sources, from Marsham Rov, and he is concerned about the people making the tefillin kesher in a way that's easy to adjust. And he's saying if that's undermining the permanence of the knot. And also the Mr. Brewer also has a similar complaint. He says that people have started making the kesher of the shel rosh in a way that's easy to adjust, to make less effort. If you need to enlarge it or to make it smaller. And he says he doesn't like that, because then it's making it into a loop. We know also that the Avnei Nezer wasn't happy with the idea of adjusting the knot of the shel rosh, and the Rebbe disagrees with Avnei Nezer, and he says that since you're doing a mitzvah with it, that gives it a permanence. He uses the idea, you have mitzvose achshave, you have the idea that the Gemara asks about the Mishkan, that what you call it's called building, but it's a portable, how you prefabricated, it can be taken apart. And the Gemara says, even since this is Alpi Hashem Yisru, Alpi Hashem Yachnu, command kvi dami. The Mishkan is under the instructions of the Hashem when to be encamped, and therefore it gives it a certain permanence. Just also reminds me, I've perhaps said this before, I heard from Rebbe Pevsner, Olav Shalom, the Rov of Anash in Paris. He also was the founder of a schools called Sinai Schools, and he took the full responsibility of fundraising, etc. And he once expressed his frustration to the Rebbe that he sees boys who go in and they go out after, let's say, 7-8 years in the school, and there's no trace. There's no Yiddishkeit stuck to them, and he was finding it very frustrating. And the Rebbe said to him, so he told me, you, I have to tell you what's written in Tanya. When a mitzvah is done, it's got an eternity to it, which lasts forever and ever. So the Rebbe uses this idea, the eternity of a mitzvah, to say, therefore, don't call it a temporary knot. You're doing a mitzvah, it's permanent. Gashmi is you're adjusting it, but that's how the Rebbe disagreed with the Avnei Nezer, who had a problem with adjusting the shilrosh. But what we are seeing, despite that, but there is the insistence that the shilrosh has to be also secured with a kesher. It has to be tightened around the head by means of a knot. What I have a problem, therefore, is that when this is pulled loose, then it's not being secured on the head by means of a knot. It's being secured by a loop rather than by a knot. Therefore, I don't think that's okay. Okay, let's move on to the next point. So here someone sent me a photograph of a piece of some kind of jewelry, and if you look carefully, you see it looks like a mezuzah, and it's got the letters Shi and Dalad Yud, which are it's one of the names of HaShem. Actually, on the outside of a mezuzah, we have this Shem Shi and Dalad is written in the gap. It's on the other side of the gap. We have Shema and then V'hoyim Shemoya. The word V'hoya is inset, and on the other side of the inset, on the other side of the parchment, the 3 letters of Shi and Dalad Yud are written. That's besides the other on the other side of HaShem is also written upside down letters. But meanwhile, this is so there's someone has made here a piece of jewelry made of gold or of some sort of, not sure how it's pure gold, doesn't matter. It's got here Hashem's name, Shi and Dalad Yud. So there's 2 questions here. One is about wearing this in going to unclean place, toilet, etc. The other one is whether you're allowed to wear it altogether. So I mentioned the sefer before, a sefer which specializes on the yonim of Shemis, etc. Sefer called Ginzei HaKodesh. You can see here on the note here, the name. So he writes, so you're not allowed to write Hashem's name on utensils, cloths. If one did write Hashem's name on a keli, one would not be allowed to use that keli. And he mentions about cutting off that piece and putting that piece into gniza, or putting the whole thing into gniza. Other sources seem to tell me that the whole thing becomes kind of, in this case, the whole thing would be toffel to Hashem's name, to the Shi and Dalad Yud, and therefore you wouldn't be allowed to use it for, gives it a kedusha, and we wouldn't be allowed to use it for mundane purpose. The other point, which is that wouldn't be allowed to put on one of Hashem's names, and if you did, you wouldn't be allowed to use it, and certainly you wouldn't be allowed to go with it into a Beis HaKisei. So that seems to be that this whoever is doing this is not doing Halocho. They shouldn't be producing this kind of stuff. But really, you can't use it. You can't sell it for the value in precious metals either, because it would mean Hashem's name would be erased by melting it down, which wouldn't be permitted. Let's move on. Okay. Somehow this came my way, that someone writes to me that years ago she heard a shiur of mine where I said you are allowed to read recipe books on Shabbos, and she wanted to have some clarification. So come back before we go into these recipe books. Someone's asking, can it be worn under the shirt? And the answer is, well, there's two issues here. One is whether it can be worn in a way that's covered with a double cover. I'm not sure whether under the shirt is then that it does solve it, but it does. It is like you can have, let's say, if you need to go and have a safer with you, if a double cover, then you would be allowed to take it with, possibly. But here there's another thing, that you shouldn't use something which is sacred for mundane need, for mundane fulfillment. So you're using something which has got Hashem's name. I just digress for a moment. I've said this a couple of times by a bar mitzvah drasha. Why is it that if you're wearing tefillin, this says you have to have kedushas haguf, and that's why you don't give a tefillin to a young child, because they can't look after their body to be clean the whole time. Doesn't say that by holding a sefer Torah. Doesn't say that you have to have kedushas haguf to hold a sefer Torah. And the meaning of the answer is that the wearing the tefillin is as if the tefillin parashas were written on your own body, as if you are the parchment for the tefillin. It happens to be, it's done with a box with the straps, but it's really the famous word of the Alter Rebbe, Elu tefillin shebereish, that the tefillin becomes part of you, shebereish, not al hareish. So it becomes part of you, and that's why, because I am the parchment of the tefillin for Hashem's name, therefore I have to be in a state of kedushas haguf. So coming back to this, this piece of jewelry has got Hashem's name, so it's got a kedusha. So it shouldn't be used for a mundane purpose, just as a piece of jewelry. It would be considered disgraceful to use something sacred as a piece of jewelry. That's what that seif had just said. Okay, let's move on about reading material on Shabbos. So there is a concept of shtore hedyotis. One shouldn't be reading mundane stuff on Shabbos, but let's read carefully. This is from the Shmir Shabbos Hilchasa. Says, Minhag Din, you would be allowed to read the news in the newspaper, but you wouldn't be allowed to read advertisements. The American listeners are advertisements. And also not to read sales, purchase, job offers. Then he has about Heroas Bishul, a guidance on how to do cooking, also shouldn't be read on Shabbos. So now in the note of Neuvet in his Shmir Shabbos Hilchasa, he says, why shouldn't you read cookbooks on Shabbos? Because there's a concept of mitzoi chefzecha. You shouldn't be pursuing your mundane needs. Now, if I was a car mechanic, I would save a lot of money. But if I was a car mechanic, I would be reading manuals. Now, would I be allowed to read a manual for my car on Shabbos? That would not be allowed, because it's mitzoi chefzecha. I'm reading how to fix this, how to, etc., which wouldn't be allowed. So think of a cookbook as being a guide how to do cooking, which is not allowed to do on Shabbos. So for that reason, one shouldn't be reading a cookbook on Shabbos. Now then, he quotes from Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Zatzal, who says that possibly the cookbook is not so much telling you how to light a fire and how to put a pot on the fire. It's telling you how to put this ingredient to give that ingredient, that to make it give it a better taste. And therefore, he says it's possibly more a science and learning information more so than actually guidance how to do malacha. It's just telling you, it's teaching you how to make food more tasty. On that basis, so he's kind of finding a little bit of a limud zchus, or that you would be allowed to read it. So there is a little bit of leniency in there, but the post psak, which of Neuvet does put down, is that one shouldn't be reading cookbooks. I don't know whether he's talking for men or for women. Or in other words, for people who do cook, or just the consumers of the cooking. I'm not sure, but let's move on. Right. Here's a question which, very sad question, which is sometimes it comes a point where a shul is no longer viable, and what could you do with that premises? And it's unfortunately happened many times, and so this is from sewn-in in Shulchan Aruch, sewn-in Kuf Nun Gimel, where it talks about sale of a shul, and it should not, that whether the buyer would be allowed to use it for making into a bathhouse, tannery, mikveh, etc. So things which she says it shouldn't be sold for those disgraceful purposes. So let's say to use it to sell a shul, and it's going to be made into an abattoir. And certainly if it's going to be made into something like a Halocho Pritzes, as a disco venue or something like that, then what about Bichlal selling it to a goy? One should, well, what goy is going to move in? Is that considered also disgraceful use? Let's say there's a shul within an apartment, and that's for some reason they've wound up that shul. Can it be sold just as a dwelling? For an individual wants to move there. So they say also that would be considered a disgrace, and certainly to sell it for a place of worship. That's the general guidance. And in the note here on this Piskei Teshuvos, he says if it's to be sold for a place of worship, is worse than these other purposes. And he refers us to Igris Moshe, and he says that's actually very disgraceful. And we see in the Gemara, it says a story, Rabbi Yosef in the Gemara Yavamas Tzadik Vov, that Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma, he was passing by a particular place, a shul, which the people had been not behaving appropriately, and he says, I would be surprised if this will not be transformed into a place of Avodah Zarah worship. So what he's seeing in this, that this is a form of punishment. If it's going to be used as an abattoir, that's not an oynish. But if it's not a punishment, it's okay. It's wrong. It's disgraceful, but it's not a punishment. But if it's going to be used as a Avodah Zarah, that's really would be seen as a punishment. That's the first point which Moshe writes. Then in Siman Mem Daled, he discusses B'shas Hadchak, if it is sold to an agent, then the agent will possibly sell it to a place of worship. So that's the way that's one way around it. If it's sold to a middleman, and then that middleman sells it to another party. Practically, I would refer anyone who has this shaila to someone like the London Bezdin, who have unfortunately lots of experience in this, and they certainly have a procedure which is acceptable halacha. Let's move on. So this weekend, there is something going on in New York. It's called the C-Teens Shabbaton. Baruch HaShem, 3,000 young people coming for Shabbos. And one of the volunteers asked the following question in connection to this, about hanging up posters. You have events here, there, and all over Crown Heights. You've got different venues being used for the Shabbaton. And so if you have a poster and you want to hang it up, are you allowed to use zip ties, whatever you call them, wire, what do you know what I'm talking about, yeah? Those things which got teeth, and they have a eye, you put the tongues through this eye, and they can go one way. It's a one-way street. You can't pull them out again. There are similar kind of things which are used for bracelets in hospitals, that an identity tag with a similar idea. And this is what's being discussed here in the Shemiras Shabbos Kelchosa, whether such a thing would be allowed to be put on Shabbos. So he says, azikonim. This is what we call zip ties. So azikonim, don't expect to find the word azikonim anywhere in Shas. It's obviously a new word. Shesgirosom, he al yedei shinaim hafuchos. It's like it's got like teeth which kind of seize upon one another, and you cannot separate it. So he says you are allowed to use them. Mutalish damish bahem. And he's quoting here from Rav Elyashiv, Shlita, now Zichrono Livracha, and he says it's not comparable to sewing because you're not connecting separate pieces. Now, so just to clarify this, what is the question here altogether? We call them zip ties, and we know what tying means. You're taking string and connecting two things by putting rope and then making a knot. See, that's connecting. I suspect that even though Rav Elyashiv is permitting this, he's referring to a bracelet around the wrist or similar, where it's not connecting two things to one another. It's just the bracelet is on itself. I think our case is more of a problem because it's actually connecting, let's say, the poster to a pole or something, to some part of the building. So it is tying one thing to the other. And therefore I suspect that even Rav Elyashiv, who was makel with the bracelet, with the identity bracelet, wouldn't be so keen to allow the use of zip ties and Shabbos. And so this is from the Shmir Shabbos Kilchosa. And the other note here is from the Piskei Teshuvos in Simashin Yud Zayin, talking about not tying. He says, on the one hand, he says, it's a permanent kind of tying, even though it's not tying in the literal sense of making a structure of tying ropes one over the other. But he still says it is, after all, it is a form of tying. Would it be the same with Velcro? I think not, because Velcro is easy to separate, and therefore it doesn't. This is pretty permanent. You can only, once you've put the zip ties, you can't open it. You're going to have to cut through somewhere else on the plastic. Let's move on. So, someone asked me this week about using a silver dish for my machronim. I seem to remember that we once discussed this a couple of years ago, perhaps. Baruch HaShem, I managed to do my index going back to about 2 years, but I didn't know, it must have been more than 2 years ago. You got the link on the weekly sheet now. You got a link to the index, so you're welcome to enjoy it. It's a Google document. This is from Sefer HaSichos and in Tofshin base. They wanted to serve the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, Mayim Achronim, with a silver dish. And he says that once the Mittler Rebbe asked the Alter Rebbe, what will be the concept of Mayim Achronim in the Osid Lovi in times of Mashiach, because by then there will be no longer the spirit, there will no longer be the Ruach HaTumah, and therefore, what will be the Inyan of Mayim Achronim? And the Alter Rebbe answered, the Mayim Achronim will be for those who are oisik in Yoneh Olam B'Tahara, those who are engaging in mundane in Yonim in a pure way. So I think what he's saying is that there won't be tumah, but there will still be mundane activities. And so the Mayim Achronim will be to purify from mundane engagements. And then the Rebbe said, Damos, in the times of Mashiach, then we'll be able to use Mayim Achronim with a silver keli. So what he's basically is saying that the Mayim Achronim is got to do with tumah, and we don't want to celebrate tumah, and therefore wouldn't use a silver keli. The Frierdiker Rebbe is not the only one who took exception to using silver for Mayim Achronim. And here is from the Piskei Teshuvos from Siman Kuf Pei Aleph, and he says it's customary to have a simple and cheap dish because the water goes into the dish is the portion of the Sitra Achra, and he quotes in the notes there several, the Tzanzerov, etc., some Chassidische Rebbes, etc., who also had the same problem with using a silver dish for Mayim Achronim. What should you do if you have one? All right, use it as a sweet dish. I don't know. Okay. I've been. Someone's writing. He was given a silver Mayim Achronim dish from Eretz Yisrael, and the instruction says not to use it with water. Okay. Very useful. Right, now coming back, I missed out number 8, and the reason is because number 8 was about mixing tuna flakes with mayonnaise, and I've gone through this before. Someone asked me this week, and that's why I want to discuss it again. The common, I believe it's not so well known. There is a malacha called losh, which is kneading, creating a dough, and that's, let's say you take flour and add water, and you're creating a mass. And that is a malacha which is forbidden on Shabbos. So when you've got loose particles, and by adding some kind of binding agent, or releasing a binding agent, but in the case of flour, you're releasing a stickiness in the flour, that's considered losh. So adding mayonnaise to loose flakes, and now they're going to become a mass, that would be a problem to do on Shabbos. The reason why there's no it's not on the screen. It's in Rav Forkash's Sefer Shabbos Halocho, Chelik Gimel, chapter Chov Beis, paragraph Ayin. It's not, that Sefer is not on the Yotzer HaChochma. Therefore, I wasn't able to copy and paste it, but he writes quite clearly not to do so, neither with mashed eggs nor with tuna. Okay, thank you, Reb Mendel, for reminding me. Let's move on. So last week, we had this shocking discussion about davening after a farbrengen being a question of being davening when you're tipsy. So someone contacted me and said, is it possible that there's a difference between some drinking and drinking when it's part of celebration of Shabbos, part of celebration of Simchas Torah, etc.? Does it make a difference? I wasn't so impressed with that suggestion, but actually he was mechaven to the Mahashal says this. Shlomo who was a cousin and a contemporary of the Arizal. And we'll look at this carefully now. Just one point, and that is that we all know that there's widespread minhag mentioned already in the Levush, who lived also about 400 and something years ago, of on Simchas Torah, we do birchas koyanim at Shacharis, not at Musaf. The reason being that before Hakofas and Kriyas HaTorah, it's customary to have a Kiddush, and we don't want the koyanim to be doing birchas koyanim when inebriated. So it's interesting. We are concerned about birchas koyanim. We're not concerned about the people davening. Why don't you know why? So evidently there is a tolerance.
Yeah, I came to you one after.
There's a tolerance for davening, even if it's there are post some drinking. So this you have on the screen. This is the Marshal or Shlomo Luria in he's got a sefer on the Shas called Yamshil Shlomo, and it's more like psokim. All right, so he writes the following. Efshaloima, possibly, the Chachamim did not forbid this lechatchila only on a weekday, because you could, after having had your drink, you could wait until the wine dissipates, the effect of the wine dissipates. But if it's a day of Yom Tov, the mitzvah to rejoice, and Chetz Yolachem, Yom Tov is a time also to celebrate in a physical way, which means with food and drink. Therefore, perhaps this is suggesting that since the tefillah is a valid tefillah, and therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu will accept our tefillah, since you're samech v'tov leiv, you are rejoicing Hashem's simcha. And then he brings the medrash on the pasuk, v'anise filosi l'cho Hashem eis rotze. We say on Mincha, Shabbos at Mincha, after Asher Voltzion, we say the pasuk v'anis filosi. So Chachamim say, what's the significance of that pasuk? It says in Pasuk in Tehillim, Yasichu v'yosh v'yishoah v'yines shoysei shecher. that I will be chatted about by those who are sitting by the gates and those who are singing after with drinking beer or strong alcohol. And the next pasuk is V'anis filosi, says David before Hashem, Ribono shel Olam. This nation is not like the other nations of the world. The other nations of the world, when they drink, and they get drunk, and then they go wild. But we're not like this. We have drunk. In other words, we've had our Shabbos meal. We've had to drink, and then we come back to shul. We should daven mincha. V'anisa filosi. I'm now davening mincha. So the vanis filosi is kind of saying, although I've had a drink, and still I'm davening. So the mashal is quoting that. Now it's not a solid proof, because it could be, yes, you've had a drink, but you had a rest. So you come back and you're a bit groggy perhaps, but you still pull yourself out and you go back to shul for mincha. That could be, but he invokes that idea. Right, so now, of course, the difference between koyanim and everyone else, for a koyan to do birchas koyanim when he's intoxicated with a revius of wine, it's much more subtle and much more, in other words, it's stricter, because even a little bit of intoxication is going to be a problem, whereas for davening, it's only when they are already tipsy. But now let's read the Alter Rebbe. Also, this is in Siman Tzadik Tes, and let's read this carefully. One who is shosri, we said last week, shosri and shiur. Shosri means a bit tipsy. It doesn't mean that he's, galloping around like a horse. So a person who is a bit tipsy can't wait until he feels that the wine has dissipated. He says, therefore, nowadays we're not so careful about this, that we would daven, even though one would daven, even though he had a revius of wine or more, because our wines are not as strong as the wines back then. Certainly if you're davening from a Sidur, so then don't have to worry about a little or a bit of intoxication. And even if you're davening by heart, it's not such an issue. If otherwise you will miss the time of davening, and this is the important point. Which is also the Marshal said this, but the Alter Rebbe didn't bring both points. The Marshal had said a difference between Yom Tov and weekdays, and he said another thing, that nowadays people are not mechaven, not so focused in their davening in any case. And the Alter Rebbe does not buy the heter of the Marshal that because it's Yom Tov it's okay, but he does take this approach that if one is a little bit, since we're not mechaven so well in any case, therefore a little bit of tipsiness is not a reason not to daven, if otherwise you're going to miss Zman Tefillah. By contrast, if a person has really lost their marbles, so then he's not able to daven, to speak to a melech, then he wouldn't be allowed to daven. And it says it's so severe, it says if it's over Avodah Zarah, and if he did daven and then he's come to, he would have to daven again. So that seems to be the answer, that because now this is what the Hemshech of the Shulchan Aruch, so since nowadays we're not mechaven so much with tefillah, therefore there is a tolerance for a minimal intoxication to tipsiness that would be allowed to daven. Right. Someone's asking, Ma'ariv after Purim Suda. So yeah, if you manage to get to shul, I would trust that you are not shiur legamri, because then you wouldn't find your way to shul. Right. Let's our last thing on the list here was last week we had a discussion about, do goyim have the koyach of tefillah? I know I'm almost over time, but I hope you will forgive me for overstepping the hour limit. So the Rebbe Meir Zirkin sent me two sources. One is a medrash here, and it says a medrash that Avodah Zarah is near and far, and Kadosh Baruch Hu is far and near. Well, what does it mean? Avodah Zarah is near and far. Well, the Avodah Zarah, the idol, is in his house, so it's near. And what does it mean it's far? Because he'll cry out to it, it doesn't answer, so it's far. Kadosh Baruch Hu is far and near, because from here to heaven is a distance of 500 years of walking. So Kivyochel, the Hebrew is far, so to speak. Yet HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and yet HaKadosh Baruch Hu is close, because a person davens and he has thoughts inside his heart, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is right there listening to his prayer. As we have the pasuk which we discussed last week, Shemer Tefilo, Adecha Kol Basi Yavayu, said David before Hashem, the Rebbeinu Shalom, when the Ummah come to daven to you, don't answer them, because they're not coming with sincerity. First they go to their idols and they pray to them. And when they don't answer them, then they see they're stuck, and then they come to you. Therefore, you shouldn't answer them. That's what it says. Apostle, Yeshavu ve'ein Moshiach al HaShem v'lo yonam. Yeshavu, they will cry out, and there's no salvation. And they cry out to Hashem, and He doesn't answer them. So He explains what that pasuk is saying. Yeshavu lavedes kechavim shalhem. First, they're crying out to the avodah zarah, and that's to no avail. Then they come to you. Then Hashem, then Hashem, you come now to Hashem. Then Hashem just doesn't listen. That was David's plea to Hashem. Whereas Yidden, when they come, they ask Hashem, they dive straight to Hashem. Therefore, Bakori Aneni Elketzid, Hashem should listen to their prayer. So, what I'm seeing from this medrash is in a way supportive. That if a goy davens and is doing avodah zarah and then turns to Hashem later as an alternative, then that's where David is saying that Hashem should not listen to their prayer. But if it's Sheva Mitzvahs, he keeps Sheva Mitzvahs, Noach, etc., he's turning to Hashem in sincerity. So then the Tefillah of a Goy would also be listened to. One last point, which also Rabbi Zerkin sent me, this article. This is by someone called Rebbe Prince, and he's published several volumes of Shalos HaTshuvos called Avnei Derech. I saw a few volumes on the shelf in the shul over here the other day. Anyway, he was asked a question about publishing a Sidur for Bnei Noach. It's a five pages. He certainly takes the view that there is a koyach of tefillah for Ummah Olam. However, his conclusion is not to publish a Sidur. It's, in other words, they want to pray, but not to formalize it. Leave it informal. Let them do their own things. I know that we discussed this once on the shiur a while back, that when someone wanted to put together a kind of Shulchan Aruch for Bnei Noach, and the Rebbe said something he doesn't want that a guy should say, that Yidden are dictating to them exactly what to do. So inspiration, yes. Dictating exactly what to say, what not to say, etc. Let them do their own thing, and we'll do our thing. As they have the pasuk which we say every morning in davening in the weekdays. I wish you all a good tavoch, and we should have Besuras Tevis Kaltov. Suras Hagula with Aliya Novi.
Thanks very much. Very interesting. I gained from it. Thank you.